Well, residents still clearly feeling the impact of the environmental damage caused by that fire. Joined now by Rico Euripidou, the environmental health campaigner at Groundwork. Rico, good afternoon to you. We all know now, well, it certainly seems likely, let me put it like that UPL did not actually follow the law. What action do you think needs to follow?
Well, it's interesting that you say that. The minister was very clear in the findings of this intergovernmental investigation into what had actually happened and whether or not UPL had met all the licensing requirements and had all the requisite permits in place. And she was very clear to say that at face value, it appears as if the licenses, should the licensing process had happened and should the requisite licenses the process had been followed, then notwithstanding the fire, regardless of the fire and the aftermath of the fire, what happened in the environment would not have happened. Adequate mitigation measures would have been put in place, and the law would have required UPL to have those measures in place that would have prevented the release of all of those chemicals into the environment.
Should there now be, do you believe there should be criminal action against the company or against individuals within the company who allowed this to happen, who perhaps didn't follow the law?
I have no doubt that there will be criminal action, not just against the company, but also against the property company that leased the warehouse to UPL. There are irregularities in all the aspects of licensing that ultimately led them to, conducting their business in that place. So, for example, among the 8 agencies that had oversight for undertaking that kind of activity at that place, within each of those ambits of those pieces of legislation and regulations, there might be criminal liability within each of those. So, for example, within the ambit of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, there is a trigger that would have required UPL to conduct an investigation or an assessment of whether this was to be deemed what's called a major hazardous installation. And had it been deemed a major hazardous installation, then a whole lot of requirements follow that. But bypassing that act and what the minister ultimately communicated to the public is that UPL showed a disregard for the law, a consistent disregard for the law, because it wasn't just one law that it failed to comply with. It failed to comply with a whole bunch of laws. So for each one under the ambit of each piece of legislation, there could be criminal liability. There could be civil liability within each piece of legislation also. That's up to the prosecuting authority to decide, not necessarily the minister.
So, what we're talking about now is you want proper legal action to follow. I'm trying to think of previous examples where that has actually happened, where individuals have been held responsible in our law, in South African law, for an environmental disaster like this.
It hasn't happened very often. There have been the odd occasions where there has been some criminal liability. I think the jail terms are up to 5 years or a maximum of 10 years and a 10 million rand fine. It's something that consistently comes up, within the report that the minister released. But I think you have to look very hard in our law to find those examples. It doesn't happen very often. Hopefully now this sets a strong precedent, and it sets an example that, you have to follow the law, regardless of whether something is an act of God or whether, the fires occurred as a result of civil unrest. It doesn't matter. What the report finds is that had UPL followed the law and had it been compliant with the law and not disregarded the law, regardless of what happened subsequently, the measures would have been in place to mitigate such an environmental disaster. And that's an important thing that the minister reiterated, is that we are still in the acute phase of an environmental emergency. This is probably our biggest environmental emergency that we've ever had in South Africa.
Sure. I mean, it would seem then unlikely that the area around this warehouse is ever going to recover.
Well, that was another interesting observation from the report and from the minister herself, to say that the marine environment is largely sterile. This is the Umhlanga River and also the Umhlanga Lagoon and the Umhlanga estuary, and that there is extensive damage not to just marine life, but also to vegetation, to riparian vegetation, and that damage extends out to sea also. Another interesting thing that the minister said was that even though UPL and some of the experts contracted by UPL have made the recommendation that the beaches be opened, and let's just to remind you, the beaches have been closed now for 2.5 months for a 50-kilometer stretch from Shaka's Rock all the way down to the Umhlanga River mouth, with huge impacts on livelihoods of people that rely on the ocean economy for their livelihoods, and also the tourism sector. And the minister said the reason why they are taking such a strong precautionary approach is because she doesn't want to be responsible for that family with a small child that digs up a little bit of poison in the sea sand that was missed by some kind of, remediation process, or somebody's pet, suffers some kind of ill effect as a result of poison. She doesn't want to take that responsibility. And that in her experience, she's listening to the science and she's taking a precautionary approach, which, at face value seems to be the right thing to do.
Rico Euripidou, thanks very much indeed, environmental health campaigner at Groundwork. I really appreciate the time.